Sarah Mitchell had always considered herself an experienced hiker. At 28, she had climbed mountains across 3 states and never once needed rescue. Her hiking boots were worn from countless trails, her backpack organized with military precision, and her confidence unshakable. That morning in late September, as she stood at the trailhead of Copper Canyon in northern Montana, she felt the familiar thrill of adventure calling her name. The weather forecast had promised clear skies for the entire weekend. Sarah planned a solo 3-day hike through the remote canyon system, something she had been dreaming about for months. The trail was marked as difficult, winding through dense forest and rocky terrain for nearly 40 miles. Most hikers took 4 or 5 days to complete it, but Sarah was determined to prove she could do it faster. She started her hike at dawn, the crisp mountain air filling her lungs as she stepped onto the narrow dirt path. Tall pine trees stretched toward the sky on both sides, their branches heavy with morning dew. The sound of her boots crunching on fallen leaves was the only noise breaking the peaceful silence of the wilderness. For the first 6 hours, everything went according to plan. Sarah made excellent time, covering 12 miles before stopping for lunch beside a crystal-clear stream. She checked her map and GPS device, confirming she was exactly where she expected to be. The trail ahead looked challenging, but manageable, winding up a steep ridge that would offer spectacular views of the valley below. After lunch, Sarah noticed the weather beginning to change. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the wind picked up, rustling the trees with increasing intensity. She checked her weather app, but her phone showed no signal. The forecast she had seen that morning was probably outdated, she thought. Mountain weather could change quickly, but she had dealt with rain before. Her gear was waterproof, and she had a good tent. As she climbed higher, the trail became more difficult to follow. Fallen trees blocked several sections, forcing her to navigate around them through thick underbrush. The official trail markers, which had been frequent earlier, became sparse and sometimes missing entirely. Sarah relied more heavily on her GPS device, but the dense tree cover made the signal weak and unreliable. By late afternoon, the clouds had turned black and threatening. The first drops of rain began to fall, quickly becoming a steady drizzle that soaked through everything. Sarah pulled on her rain jacket and continued hiking, determined to reach the designated camping area marked on her map. According to her calculations, it should only be another 3 miles ahead. But those 3 miles seemed to stretch endlessly. The trail became increasingly unclear, sometimes disappearing completely under layers of wet leaves and fallen branches. Sarah found herself stopping frequently to check her GPS and map, trying to figure out exactly where she was. The device showed her position jumping around inconsistently, sometimes placing her on the trail, sometimes hundreds of yards away from it. As darkness approached, Sarah realized she had a serious problem. She should have reached the camping area hours ago, but nothing around her looked familiar. The landscape had changed from the pine forest she expected to a dense mixture of aspen and birch trees, their white bark ghostly in the fading light. Rocky outcroppings jutted up from the forest floor, creating a maze-like terrain she didn't remember seeing on any map. Sarah tried to retrace her steps, but in the growing darkness and continuing rain, everything looked the same. Every tree, every rock formation, every small clearing seemed identical to the last. Panic began to creep into her thoughts, but she forced herself to stay calm. She was an experienced hiker. She had emergency supplies. She would figure this out. She decided to stop for the night and reassess her situation in the morning when she could see clearly. Finding a relatively flat spot between 2 large boulders, Sarah set up her tent with shaking hands. The rain had intensified, making everything slippery and difficult. Her headlamp provided the only light in the complete darkness of the wilderness night. Inside her tent, Sarah spread out her map and tried to make sense of her situation. She estimated she had hiked about 18 miles that day, but her GPS showed conflicting information. Sometimes it indicated she was still on the main trail, Other times it placed her several miles to the east in unmarked territory. The battery was getting low, and she knew she needed to conserve power for emergencies. She ate a cold dinner of energy bars and dried fruit, trying to convince herself that everything would look better in the morning. Outside her tent, the rain continued to fall steadily, creating a constant drumming sound on the fabric above her head. Strange noises echoed through the forest, branches cracking, animals moving through the underbrush, and the distant call of what might have been a wolf or coyote. Sleep came fitfully. Every sound made Sarah jolt awake, her heart pounding with adrenaline. She dozed off and on throughout the night, dreaming of familiar trails and warm, dry hotel rooms. When she finally woke to pale gray light filtering through her tent, she felt exhausted and disoriented. The rain had stopped, but everything outside was soaked and dripping. Sarah packed her wet gear and studied her map again in the better light. She decided to head what she believed was north, toward the main ridge line where she hoped to intersect with a known trail. Her GPS showed 30% battery remaining, which worried her more than she wanted to admit. The second day of hiking proved even more challenging than the first. The terrain grew increasingly rugged, with steep hillsides and dense vegetation that forced her to move slowly and carefully. Several times she had to backtrack when she encountered impassable cliffs or thick tangles of fallen trees. By afternoon, Sarah admitted to herself that she was truly lost. Nothing she saw matched her map or her memory of the area. Her GPS had died despite her efforts to conserve battery, leaving her with only a compass and her increasingly unreliable sense of direction. She had been hiking in circles, she realized, recognizing a distinctive rock formation she had passed twice before. The rational part of her mind told her to stay calm and think logically. Lost hikers who panicked made bad decisions that often made their situation worse. She needed to find water, shelter, and a way to signal for help. Her cell phone still had no signal, but she tried sending text messages anyway, hoping they might go through if she moved to higher ground. As the sun began to set on her second day in the wilderness, Sarah felt fear settling into her chest like a cold stone. She was an experienced hiker, yes, but she had never been lost like this before. She had food for maybe 2 more days if she rationed carefully. Water was less of a concern since she had purification tablets and had crossed several small streams. But the nights were getting colder, and she wasn't prepared for extended wilderness survival. She made camp again, this time choosing a spot near a small creek where the sound of running water provided some comfort. As she set up her tent, Sarah tried to remember everything she knew about wilderness survival. Stay in one place so rescuers can find you, or keep moving to find your way out. Signal for help, but how? She had a whistle and a small mirror, but in this dense forest, who would hear or see her signals? That night, as she lay in her sleeping bag listening to the creek gurgle nearby, Sarah made a decision. Tomorrow she would pick a direction and stick to it, no matter what. She couldn't keep wandering in circles. She would head downhill, following water, which should eventually lead to civilization. It was basic wilderness wisdom. Water always flows toward bigger water, and people build settlements near water sources. But as she made this plan, dark thoughts crept into her mind. What if she was deeper in the wilderness than she thought? What if the nearest town was 50 miles away? What if no one would think to look for her until she failed to return to work on Tuesday? That gave her 4 more days, maybe 5. Could she survive that long in the wilderness with her limited supplies? Sarah pulled her sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders and tried to push away the fear. She was strong, she was smart, and she was determined. She would find her way out of this forest. She had to. People were counting on her to come home safe. Her sister would worry when she didn't call on Sunday evening, as promised. Her colleagues would notice when she didn't show up for Monday's important meeting. Outside her tent, an owl called through the darkness, its haunting voice echoing off the unseen trees. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing she would need all her strength for the challenges that lay ahead. Somewhere out there was a trail, a road, a ranger station, or another hiker who could help her. She just had to keep moving and stay alive long enough to find them. The third morning dawned gray and cold, with frost covering her tent and everything around it. Sarah's breath formed visible clouds in the frigid air as she packed her gear with numb fingers. She had slept poorly again, waking every hour to strange sounds and the growing cold. Her sleeping bag was rated for temperatures down to 30 degrees, but last night had felt colder than that. She followed her plan and headed downhill, staying close to the creek she had camped beside. The terrain was rough and slippery from the recent rain and morning frost. Several times she slipped on wet rocks or loose soil, once falling hard enough to scrape her knee and tear her hiking pants. Each fall shook her confidence a little more. By midday, Sarah realized that following the creek wasn't leading her to civilization as she had hoped. Instead, the stream seemed to wind deeper into the wilderness, through increasingly remote and rugged country. The forest grew thicker and darker, with massive old-growth trees that blocked out most of the sunlight. She hadn't seen any signs of human presence, no trail markers, no garbage, no cut stumps, nothing to suggest people had ever been in this area. Her food supplies were running dangerously low. She had eaten her last full meal that morning and now had only a handful of energy bars and some dried fruit remaining. The creek provided plenty of water, but she needed calories to keep her body warm and her mind sharp. She tried to remember what she knew about edible plants, but most of the vegetation around her was unfamiliar. Eating the wrong thing could poison her, making her situation even worse. As afternoon faded into evening, Sarah faced the terrifying reality that she might not survive this ordeal. She had been lost for 3 days now, and instead of finding her way out, she seemed to be getting deeper into trouble. Her body ached from sleeping on the ground, her clothes were damp and dirty, and she could feel her energy levels dropping with each passing hour. That night, huddled in her tent beside yet another nameless creek, Sarah allowed herself to cry for the first time since this nightmare began. She thought about her family, her friends, her comfortable apartment back in the city. She wondered if anyone was looking for her yet, and whether search and rescue teams would ever find her in this vast wilderness. The forest felt infinite and hostile, full of hidden dangers and false hopes. But even in her darkest moment, Sarah refused to give up completely. She was lost, scared, and running out of supplies, but she was still alive. Tomorrow she would keep moving, keep fighting, keep hoping for rescue or escape. She had to believe that somewhere out there, someone would help her find her way home. Sarah woke on the 4th morning to the sound of her own teeth chattering. The temperature had dropped well below freezing during the night, and ice had formed along the edges of the creek. Her water bottles were partially frozen, and her hiking boots were stiff with frost. Every muscle in her body ached, and she felt weaker than she had ever felt in her life. She forced herself to eat one of her remaining energy bars, chewing the cold, hard food slowly to make it last longer. The sweet taste reminded her of better times, of preparing for hikes in her warm kitchen while coffee brewed and morning sunlight streamed through her windows. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone who lived in a different world where being lost in the wilderness was just an adventure story, not a life-or-death reality. The creek had grown larger overnight, fed by several smaller streams that converged in the valley where she had camped. Sarah decided this was a good sign. Bigger water meant she was heading in the right direction, toward civilization. She packed her gear with hands that shook from cold and weakness, taking longer than usual to stuff everything into her backpack. Her movements felt clumsy and uncoordinated, as if her brain wasn't sending the right signals to her muscles. Following the creek proved more difficult than expected. The terrain became increasingly steep and rocky, forcing her to scramble over boulders and navigate around deep pools of icy water. Several times she had to leave the creek entirely and bushwhack through dense forest to get around impassable sections. Each detour cost her precious time and energy, and she worried she might lose the creek altogether. Around midday, Sarah reached a point where the creek plunged over a series of waterfalls into a deep gorge. The sound of rushing water echoed off the rock walls, creating a constant roar that made thinking difficult. She stood at the edge of the precipice, looking down into the misty chasm below, and realized she couldn't continue following the water. She would have to choose a new direction. Looking around desperately for any sign of a trail or human presence, Sarah noticed something that made her heart skip with hope. High up on the opposite ridge, barely visible through the trees, was what looked like a thin column of smoke rising into the sky. Where there was smoke, there were people. She might be saved. The climb to reach that distant ridge looked brutal, at least 3 miles of steep, heavily forested terrain with no visible path. But it was her first real hope in days, and Sarah knew she had to try. She turned away from the creek that had been her companion for so long and began climbing toward what she prayed was rescue. The ascent was a nightmare of loose rocks, fallen logs, and thorny underbrush that tore at her clothes and scratched her exposed skin. Her legs felt like rubber, shaking with exhaustion after just a few minutes of climbing. She had to stop frequently to catch her breath and rest her burning muscles. Each time she paused, the column of smoke seemed farther away than before, as if it were retreating from her approach. Halfway up the ridge, Sarah realized she had made a terrible mistake. What she had thought was smoke was actually just a wispy cloud caught between 2 peaks, dispersing slowly in the mountain wind. There was no campfire, no cabin, no people waiting to help her. She had wasted hours of precious energy climbing toward an illusion created by her desperate mind. The disappointment hit her like a physical blow. Sarah sank to her knees on the steep slope, tears streaming down her dirty cheeks. She had been so certain, so hopeful, and now she felt more lost and alone than ever before. The forest around her seemed to mock her with its indifferent beauty. Ancient trees reaching toward an uncaring sky, birds calling to each other in a language she would never understand. But staying on the mountainside wouldn't solve anything. Sarah forced herself to stand and consider her options. She could try to go back down to the creek, but that would mean admitting defeat and wasting all the energy she had spent climbing. She could continue over the ridge and see what lay on the other side, or she could try to traverse the slope, looking for easier terrain or signs of human activity. She chose to keep climbing. At least from the top of the ridge, she might be able to see farther and get a better sense of where she was. Maybe she would spot a road, or a building, or another hiker. The climb took everything she had left. Her legs trembled with each step, and she had to use her hands to pull herself up steep sections. Several times she slipped on loose stones and scraped her knees and palms raw. When she finally reached the ridgetop, Sarah's hopes were crushed once again. Spread out below her in every direction was nothing but endless wilderness. Rolling hills covered in dense forest, with no signs of civilization anywhere. No roads, no buildings, no power lines. Nothing but trees and rocks and empty sky. She might as well have been on another planet. The view did reveal something else, though. She was much farther from any known trails than she had imagined. The landscape below didn't match anything on her map, which meant she had been hiking in completely the wrong direction for days. She wasn't just lost. She was lost in some of the most remote wilderness in the entire state. As the sun began to set on her 4th day in the forest, Sarah made camp in a small clearing just below the ridgeline. She had no energy left to go farther, and her last energy bar was gone. Tomorrow she would have to find food somehow, or her situation would become truly desperate. She tried to remember everything she knew about wilderness survival, which plants were safe to eat, how to catch fish with improvised tools, how to set snares for small animals. But her knowledge felt inadequate for the reality she faced. That night was the coldest yet. Despite wearing all her extra clothes inside her sleeping bag, Sarah couldn't get warm. She shivered uncontrollably for hours, listening to the wind howl through the trees above her camp. Strange sounds echoed through the darkness, branches creaking, animals moving through the underbrush, and what sounded like something large walking around her tent in the middle of the night. She lay perfectly still, hardly breathing, until the sounds moved away. Morning brought no relief. Sarah woke to discover that snow had fallen during the night, covering everything in a thin white layer that made the world look even more alien and hostile. Her tent was partially collapsed under the weight of wet snow, and ice had formed on the inside walls from her breath. When she tried to stand up, her legs barely supported her weight. She knew she was in serious trouble now. The combination of cold, hunger, and exhaustion was affecting both her body and her mind. Simple tasks, like packing her sleeping bag, took 3 times as long as they should have. She caught herself talking to herself, having conversations with family members who weren't there. Once she found herself walking in the wrong direction entirely, heading back down the hill she had climbed the day before. Sarah forced herself to eat some pine needles, hoping they would provide vitamin C and maybe a few calories. They tasted terrible and made her stomach cramp, but she choked them down anyway. She also tried digging in the snow for roots or edible plants, but found nothing she recognized as safe to eat. Her progress that day was painfully slow. The snow made everything slippery, and she fell repeatedly, once sliding 20 feet down a steep slope before managing to stop herself by grabbing onto a tree. Each fall seemed to take more out of her than she could afford to lose. By noon, she had covered less than a mile, and she could feel her strength failing with each step. Around mid-afternoon, Sarah reached another creek, this one flowing swift and clear through a narrow valley. She collapsed beside the water and drank deeply, hoping the cold liquid would give her some energy. As she knelt by the stream, she noticed something that made her heart race with excitement. There were tracks in the mud along the water's edge. Human tracks, left by someone wearing boots. The tracks were relatively fresh, probably made within the last day or two. They headed downstream, following the creek toward whatever lay in that direction. For the first time in days, Sarah felt genuine hope. Someone else had been here recently, which meant she might not be as far from civilization as she thought. If she followed these tracks, they might lead her to safety. Following the boot prints gave Sarah new purpose and energy. She moved faster than she had in days, driven by the possibility of finally finding help. The tracks were clear and easy to follow, left by someone with a steady, purposeful gait. Whoever had made them knew where they were going. But as hours passed, Sarah's renewed energy began to fade. The tracks seemed to go on forever, winding along the creek through terrain that looked identical to everything else she had seen. Her vision started to blur from exhaustion and hunger, and she found herself stumbling over rocks and roots she should have easily avoided. As evening approached on her 5th day in the wilderness, Sarah realized she couldn't go on much longer. Her body was shutting down from lack of food and the constant stress of survival. Her clothes hung loose on her shrinking frame, and her face felt gaunt and hollow. Every step was an effort of will over a body that wanted to lie down and give up. She decided to make camp early, while she still had enough strength to set up her tent properly. The tracks continued along the creek, but she would have to follow them tomorrow, if there was a tomorrow. As she struggled with her tent poles, her hands shaking so badly she could barely grip them, Sarah wondered if anyone would ever find her body if she didn't make it through another night. Just as she finally got her tent set up, Sarah heard something that made her freeze in place. Voices, human voices, distant but unmistakable, echoing from somewhere downstream. She listened intently, afraid she might be hallucinating, but there they were again. Two men talking in low, calm tones. Sarah grabbed her whistle and blew it as hard as she could, 3 sharp blasts that echoed off the valley walls. She waited, listening desperately for any response. Nothing. She blew the whistle again and again until she was dizzy from the effort. Still nothing. Either the voices had moved away, or the men couldn't hear her over the sound of the rushing water. Abandoning her half-set tent, Sarah stumbled downstream in the direction of the voices, crashing through bushes and sliding on wet rocks in her desperation to reach them. She called out as loudly as she could, her voice cracking and weak, but still audible. "Help! Help me! I'm lost!" But when she reached the spot where she thought the voices had come from, there was no one there. Just more empty forest, more rushing water, more indifferent wilderness. Sarah sank to her knees in the snow, overwhelmed by exhaustion and despair. She might have imagined the voices entirely, her starving brain creating the sounds she most wanted to hear. As darkness fell on her 5th night in the wilderness, Sarah made a decision that terrified her. Tomorrow, she would abandon her heavy backpack and camping gear and try to cover as much ground as possible with just the clothes on her back and her water bottle. It was a desperate gamble. Without her tent and sleeping bag, she wouldn't survive another cold night in the forest. But carrying the extra weight was slowing her down too much. She needed to find help tomorrow, or she probably wouldn't get another chance. That night, sleeping in her tent for what might be the last time, Sarah thought about all the things she would miss if she died in this lonely place. She would never see her sister's wedding next spring, never get the promotion she had been working toward, never travel to Ireland like she had always planned. The small disappointments and daily struggles of her old life seemed precious now. Reminders of a world where survival was taken for granted and the future was full of possibilities. But she wasn't dead yet. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but also new chances for rescue or escape. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to dream of warmth, of safety, of the moment when this nightmare would finally end. Somewhere out there, beyond the endless trees and rocky ridges, people were living normal lives in heated houses with full refrigerators and reliable cell phone service. She just had to stay alive long enough to find them. Sarah woke before dawn on her 6th day in the wilderness, her body trembling uncontrollably from cold and hunger. Ice crystals had formed on the inside of her tent from her breathing, and her sleeping bag felt damp and inadequate against the freezing temperature. When she tried to sit up, the world spun around her, and she had to lie back down until the dizziness passed. She knew this would be her last chance. Her body was consuming itself now, burning muscle for energy since she had no food left to eat. Her mind felt foggy and disconnected, and she could barely remember what day it was or how long she had been lost. If she didn't find help today, she would be too weak to continue tomorrow. With tremendous effort, Sarah crawled out of her tent and looked around at her meager possessions. The heavy backpack that had seemed so essential a week ago now looked like an impossible burden. She made the hardest decision of her life and began removing everything except the most basic necessities. Out went the tent, the sleeping bag, the extra clothes, the camping stove, and all the other gear she had carefully selected for her hike. She kept only her water bottle, a thin emergency blanket, her whistle, and the clothes she wore. Standing up without the heavy pack felt strange, like she might float away. But she could move faster now, and speed was what she needed. Sarah took one last look at her abandoned campsite, knowing she was burning her bridges behind her. There would be no coming back to this spot. She either found rescue today, or she died trying. The creek had grown even larger during the night, swollen with snowmelt from the higher elevations. The rushing water created a constant roar that echoed through the valley, making it hard to hear anything else. Sarah followed the stream downstream, hoping it would eventually lead to a lake or river where fishermen or hunters might be found. Her progress was painfully slow. Every few hundred yards, she had to stop and rest, leaning against trees to catch her breath. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, and her vision kept blurring in and out of focus. Several times she stumbled and fell, scraping her hands and knees on the rocky ground. Each fall made her weaker, and it took longer each time to get back up. Around midday, Sarah reached a place where the creek widened into a series of deep pools connected by small waterfalls. The water was crystal clear and so cold it hurt to touch. She knelt beside the largest pool and cupped the icy water in her hands, drinking as much as she could hold. The cold liquid shocked her empty stomach, but it was the only sustenance she had. As she knelt by the water, Sarah noticed movement in the forest on the far side of the pool. Something large was walking among the trees, breaking branches and disturbing the underbrush. Her heart raced with fear. Was it a bear? A moose? In her weakened condition, she would have no chance against a large animal. But then the figure emerged from the trees, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. It was a man, tall and bearded, wearing heavy winter clothes and carrying what looked like hunting gear. He hadn't seen her yet, focused on something upstream from where she sat. Sarah tried to call out, but her voice was just a weak croak that barely carried across the water. She struggled to her feet and waved her arms frantically, finally managing to shout, "Help! Please help me!" The sound echoed off the rocks and caught the man's attention immediately. He turned toward her, his weathered face showing surprise and concern. "Hold on there," the man called back, his deep voice carrying easily across the water. "Stay right where you are. I'm coming around." Sarah sank back to her knees, overwhelmed with relief. After 6 days of hopeless wandering, she had finally found another human being. She watched as the man made his way around the pool, moving with the confident steps of someone completely at home in the wilderness. He was older than she had first thought, probably in his 50s, with gray streaking his dark beard and deep lines around his eyes. "Good Lord, what happened to you?" the man asked as he approached. Up close, Sarah could see the shock in his expression as he took in her condition. The torn clothes, the scratched and dirty face, the way she swayed even while sitting down. "Are you hurt?" "How long have you been out here?" "6 days," Sarah managed to whisper, her voice barely audible. "I got lost. I can't keep going. I'm lost." The words came out in broken fragments as tears started streaming down her cheeks. The man immediately dropped his pack and knelt beside her. "Easy there, easy. You're safe now. My name's Jack Morrison. I'm a hunting guide. Been working these woods for 30 years. You're going to be okay." Jack quickly assessed her condition with the practiced eye of someone who had dealt with wilderness emergencies before. He could see the signs of severe exhaustion, dehydration, and hypothermia. Her lips had a bluish tint, her hands were shaking uncontrollably, and her responses were slow and confused. She was in serious medical trouble. "What's your name, miss?" Jack asked gently, pulling an emergency blanket from his pack and wrapping it around her shoulders. Sarah Mitchell," she replied, her teeth chattering so hard she could barely speak. "I was hiking the Copper Canyon Trail. I got lost the first day and... She broke down completely, sobbing with exhaustion and relief. Jack had heard of the Copper Canyon Trail. It was nearly 40 miles from where they sat now, which meant this young woman had somehow wandered deep into some of the most remote wilderness in the state. How she had survived 6 days out here in her condition was a miracle. But she wasn't safe yet. She needed medical attention, and fast. "Sarah, listen to me," Jack said firmly but kindly. "I'm going to get you out of here, but I need you to stay conscious, okay? Can you do that for me?" Sarah nodded weakly. focusing on his weathered face as an anchor against the dizziness that threatened to pull her under. Jack quickly went to work, pulling emergency supplies from his well-stocked pack. He gave her small sips of warm tea from his thermos and a few bites of high-energy food, careful not to overwhelm her empty stomach. "I've got a boat about half a mile downstream," Jack explained as he worked. "It's the fastest way out of here. Think you can make it that far?" Sarah tried to stand, but immediately collapsed back down, her legs completely unable to support her weight. "I can't," she whispered. "I'm sorry. I just can't walk anymore." Jack looked at the young woman with deep compassion. She had clearly reached the absolute end of her endurance. In his 3 decades as a guide and hunter, he had seen plenty of people in trouble, but never someone so completely exhausted. Without immediate help, she might not survive another hour in these conditions. "That's okay, Sarah. I'm not going to leave you here." Jack made a decision that would require all his strength and experience. He carefully helped Sarah onto his back, carrying her piggyback style while she draped her arms weakly around his neck. She weighed almost nothing, probably 20 pounds less than when she had started her hike. The journey to his boat was one of the most difficult things Jack had ever done. Sarah drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes mumbling incoherently about trails and maps and being late for work. Her weight seemed to increase with each step as Jack's muscles strained against the burden. Several times he had to stop and rest, carefully setting her down while he caught his breath. But Jack Morrison had not survived 30 years in the wilderness by giving up when things got difficult. He thought about his own daughter, about how he would want someone to help her if she were ever in trouble like this. That thought gave him the strength to keep going, one step at a time, until they finally reached the spot where his boat waited. The boat was unlike anything Sarah had ever seen, even in her semi-conscious state. It was what Jack called a bullboat, a traditional design used by Native American tribes and mountain men, made from buffalo hide stretched over a wooden frame. The circular craft was incredibly lightweight, but surprisingly stable, perfect for navigating the shallow, rocky waters of mountain streams. Jack gently placed Sarah in the center of the boat. Wrapping her in additional blankets he kept stored there. She was barely conscious now, mumbling words he couldn't understand and shivering despite the warm coverings. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor that worried him greatly. "Hold on, Sarah," Jack said as he pushed the boat into the current. "We're going home now." The trip down the river was a race against time. Jack had to navigate carefully around rocks and fallen trees while monitoring Sarah's condition. She seemed to be slipping deeper into unconsciousness, her breathing becoming shallow and irregular. He pushed the boat as fast as he dared, using his intimate knowledge of every bend and rapid in the waterway. The river carried them through some of the most beautiful wilderness in North America, but Jack had no attention for scenery now. Towering cliffs rose on both sides, crowned with ancient pine trees that had stood for centuries. Eagles circled overhead, and deer watched from the shoreline as the strange craft passed by. But Jack's focus was entirely on the young woman who lay motionless in his boat, fighting for her life. After what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, Jack spotted the familiar landmarks that meant they were approaching his cabin. The river widened here, flowing more slowly through a broad meadow where he often saw elk and moose in the early morning. His home sat on a bluff overlooking the water, a log structure he had built himself 20 years ago when he first came to this remote valley. Jack guided the boat to his private dock and carefully lifted Sarah out, carrying her up the steep path to his cabin. She was completely unconscious now, but still breathing. He laid her on his couch near the stone fireplace and quickly built up the fire to warm the room. Then he reached for his satellite phone, one of the few modern conveniences he allowed himself in this wilderness retreat. The conversation with the emergency dispatcher was brief but urgent. Jack gave them his GPS coordinates, and described Sarah's condition in the clinical terms he had learned during his years as a wilderness guide. A medical helicopter would be dispatched immediately, but it would take at least an hour to reach his remote location. While waiting for help to arrive, Jack did everything he could to stabilize Sarah's condition. He wrapped her in warm, dry blankets and used hot water bottles to gradually bring up her body temperature. He checked her pulse and breathing regularly, talking to her in a calm, steady voice, even though she couldn't respond. "You're safe now, Sarah," he repeated over and over. "Help is coming. You made it. You're one of the toughest people I've ever met, and you're going to be fine." As he worked, Jack thought about the incredible journey this young woman had survived. 6 days alone in some of the most unforgiving wilderness on the continent, with minimal food and inadequate gear for the conditions she faced. Most people wouldn't have lasted 2 days. Whatever else happened, Sarah Mitchell was a survivor. The sound of helicopter rotors echoing through the valley was the most beautiful thing Jack had heard in years. The medical crew landed in his meadow and quickly took charge of Sarah's care, starting an IV and monitoring her vital signs while preparing her for transport. As they loaded her into the helicopter, Sarah briefly opened her eyes and looked directly at Jack. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "You saved my life." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "You saved your own life, Sarah. I just gave you a ride home." As the helicopter disappeared over the ridge, carrying Sarah toward the hospital in safety, Jack stood alone in his meadow and reflected on the day's events. In 30 years of wilderness work, he had been part of many rescue operations, but none that had affected him quite like this one. There was something special about Sarah Mitchell's determination to survive that reminded him why he had chosen to live his life in service to others who ventured into the wild places of the world. 3 weeks later, Jack received a letter at his remote cabin. It was from Sarah, written in careful handwriting, that spoke of her gradual recovery from her ordeal. She had spent 5 days in the hospital being treated for severe dehydration, hypothermia, and exhaustion, but the doctors said she would make a complete recovery. She thanked him again for saving her life and promised to be better prepared for future wilderness adventures. But what touched Jack most was the final paragraph of her letter. Sarah wrote that her experience in the forest had changed her in ways she was still discovering. She had learned things about herself, about her strength, her determination, and her will to survive, that she never would have known otherwise. The wilderness had tested her and nearly broken her, but in the end it had also revealed who she truly was. Jack smiled as he folded the letter and put it away in his desk drawer. It was the best thanks he could have received, knowing that Sarah hadn't just survived her ordeal, but had grown from it. That was the true gift of the wilderness, he thought. It demanded everything from those who entered it, but for those brave enough to accept the challenge, it offered something precious in return, the knowledge of what they were truly capable of when everything else was stripped away. Outside his cabin window, the river flowed on toward distant valleys, carrying its ancient message of persistence and hope. Jack Morrison returned to his simple life in the wilderness, ready for whatever challenges the forest might bring next, secure in the knowledge that sometimes, when it mattered most, people could find the strength to save each other.